December 15th, 1348. A peasant family in Yorkshire huddles around a dying fire. Outside, the wind howls like a banshee. Inside, their breath forms clouds in the freezing air. The baby hasn't stopped crying in hours. Their food stores are nearly empty, and winter has just begun. By morning, one of them will be dead. This isn't fiction. This was reality for millions of people during the medieval period. And here's the terrifying truth. If you were transported back to a medieval winter, you would almost certainly die. Not might die, would die. Today, we're going to explore exactly why medieval winters were humanity's deadliest enemy, and how our ancestors developed the most ingenious, desperate, and sometimes horrifying methods to survive the season that killed more people than all the wars, plagues, and famines combined. But first, let me tell you about the winter that changed everything. What happened in the winter of 1315 was so catastrophic that it literally rewrote European civilization, and it all started with a single, seemingly impossible weather event. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 began with the worst winter in living memory. But this wasn't just cold. This was apocalyptic weather that defied everything medieval people understood about seasons. Rain fell instead of snow. Crops rotted in fields. Then came the freeze, so sudden and severe that people who went to bed alive were found frozen solid the next morning. Edward II of England's own chroniclers wrote that people were eating bark, grass, and even each other. Entire villages simply vanished. But this was just the beginning of 7 years of horror. The most chilling part? Modern climate scientists now know exactly why this happened, and it's a pattern that repeated throughout the medieval period. The real cause of these killer winters was something called the Little Ice Age. And when you see what this actually did to medieval Europe, you'll understand why our ancestors lived in constant terror of winter's approach. From roughly 1300 to 1700, Earth entered what we now call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped by just 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. That doesn't sound like much, does it? But here's what that small change actually meant. The Thames River in London, which hasn't frozen solid in over 200 years, became a regular winter highway. People held frost fairs on the ice, complete with shops and ox roasts. But the fun masks a darker reality. In Scandinavia, farmland that had been cultivated for centuries became permanently frozen. In the Alps, advancing glaciers crushed entire villages. Growing seasons shortened by 30 days, meaning less food when you needed more calories to survive the cold. Medieval people had no idea this was happening. They just knew that winters kept getting deadlier, year after year, and they developed increasingly desperate strategies to survive. One of these survival strategies was so disturbing that the Catholic Church declared it a mortal sin. But when faced with freezing to death, medieval people did it anyway. In the depths of winter, when fuel was scarce and death was near, medieval families practiced something called bundling, sleeping naked together in groups, including non-family members, to share body heat. The Church was horrified. They declared that unmarried people sharing beds, even to prevent freezing to death, was sinful. But the choice was simple: sin or die. Some families took it further. They brought their livestock indoors, not just for the animals' protection, but because a cow or pig could raise the temperature of a room by several crucial degrees. Entire families lived in what were essentially barns, sharing space with animals whose waste actually helped insulate their homes. But even these desperate measures weren't enough, because medieval people faced a problem that would kill most of us within days. The biggest killer wasn't the cold itself. It was something we take completely for granted, something so basic that losing it meant certain death. And medieval people lost it every winter: fire.
Without matches, lighters, or gas stoves, keeping a fire burning was literally a matter of life and death, and medieval people were constantly losing it. A family's fire going out was such a catastrophe that neighbors would rush over with burning embers to help restart it. Some villages appointed fire keepers whose only job was to maintain a communal flame that everyone could use to relight their hearths. But here's what's truly terrifying. Starting a fire from scratch in medieval times took skilled hands 30 to 45 minutes under ideal conditions. In wet, cold weather, it could take hours, hours you might not have. The flint and steel method that most people used had about a 50% success rate even for experts. Imagine being soaked, freezing, your hands numb, trying desperately to create sparks while your family slowly dies of hypothermia around you. This is why medieval people developed fire practices that seem almost religious to us. They created something called banking the fire, a technique so crucial that families passed down the exact method through generations. But if you got it wrong even once, you'd discover the most horrifying truth about medieval winter nights. Medieval winter nights lasted up to 16 hours in Northern Europe. 16 hours of darkness, cold, and terror. Candles were made from animal fat and were incredibly expensive. A single tallow candle cost the equivalent of a day's wages for a peasant. Most families owned maybe 2-3 candles for the entire winter. They burned rushes dipped in fat, which gave off toxic smoke and barely any light. This meant that for most of winter, families lived in complete darkness from 4 p.m. to 8 a.m. No reading, no productive work, just sitting in the dark, trying to conserve body heat and wondering if they'd wake up in the morning. The psychological toll was devastating. Medieval chronicles describe a condition they called winter madness, people who became violent or catatonic during the long dark months. We now recognize this as seasonal affective disorder, but they had no treatment, no understanding, and no escape. But the darkness hid something even more dangerous. In the pitch-black medieval night, a silent killer stalked through homes, and families would wake up to find their loved ones dead with no obvious cause. This invisible assassin claimed more lives than war, and people had no idea what was happening. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Medieval people called it the quiet death because victims simply went to sleep and never woke up. Their heating systems were death traps. Open fires in poorly ventilated rooms, primitive chimneys that often backed up with smoke, braziers burning charcoal in sealed chambers. Families would block every gap to keep warmth in, unknowingly trapping deadly gases. An entire family might be found dead in their beds, peaceful expressions on their faces, with no signs of violence or disease. Villages developed superstitions about winter spirits and cold demons that stole souls in the night. The cruel irony? The better insulated your home, the more likely you were to die from the very fire keeping you warm. Medieval people faced an impossible choice: freeze to death or poison themselves trying to stay warm. But carbon monoxide wasn't the only invisible threat lurking in medieval homes. There was something growing in their walls, their food, and even their clothes that turned medieval winters into a toxic nightmare. And when you see what it was, you'll understand why medieval people feared winter more than war. Mold. Black mold, toxic mold, ergot mold that caused hallucinations and convulsions. Medieval homes were perfect breeding grounds, damp, poorly ventilated, filled with organic materials. Ergot mold on stored grain caused St. Anthony's fire. People's limbs would literally feel like they were burning from the inside. Victims would dance uncontrollably, see visions, and often lose fingers and toes to gangrene. Entire communities would go mad together when their grain stores became contaminated. Other molds caused respiratory problems that medieval people called winter lung. Families would develop chronic coughs that lasted all season, weakening them for other diseases. The mold also destroyed their food stores, turning their winter survival rations into toxic sludge. But even if you could solve the fire problem, the mold problem, and the cold problem, you still faced the challenge that killed more medieval people than anything else. Medieval winter food was so dangerous that eating it was almost as likely to kill you as starving. What they put in their bodies to survive would make you violently ill in minutes. When regular food ran out, medieval people ate things that would horrify us. Tree bark ground into flour, leather boiled into gelatinous soup, clay mixed with grain to make the meager supplies last longer. They ate famine bread made from acorns, sawdust, and whatever organic matter they could find. This bread caused severe digestive problems and often contained parasites and toxins. Desperate families consumed grass, roots, and even human waste mixed with clay. But the most disturbing survival food was documented during the Great Famine. People began eating the dead. Not just animals, human flesh became a commodity. Chronicles describe markets where human meat was sold alongside what little animal protein remained. The psychological trauma of these choices haunted survivors for life. Many medieval people preferred to die rather than eat certain survival foods because they believed it would damn their souls. But even if you could stomach the food, your body faced another deadly challenge. Your medieval body would betray you in ways that seem impossible today. There was a condition called winter scurvy that turned your own teeth into weapons against you. Scurvy wasn't just a sailor's disease, it was a winter plague. Without fresh fruits or vegetables for months, medieval people's bodies literally began to fall apart. Their teeth loosened and fell out. Old wounds reopened and refused to heal. Their gums became black and swollen. Blood vessels burst under their skin, creating horrifying purple blotches. Some victims' hair fell out in clumps. But the psychological symptoms were even worse. Scurvy causes severe depression, paranoia, and what medieval doctors called winter madness. Entire families would turn on each other, convinced that someone was stealing food or plotting against them. The most terrifying part? It was completely reversible with just a few fresh vegetables, but medieval people had no idea. They watched their loved ones transform into gaunt, paranoid, bleeding strangers and thought it was supernatural punishment. Combined with other deficiency diseases, medieval people's immune systems collapsed just when they needed them most. This is when the real killers moved in. Medieval winters weren't just cold, they were disease incubators that turned every home into a potential plague house. Crowded, unventilated homes filled with sick, malnourished people became perfect breeding grounds for disease. What we call flu season was a medieval death sentence. Pneumonia, which we treat with antibiotics today, killed up to 30% of those who contracted it. Tuberculosis spread like wildfire through families sharing beds and breathing space. Sweating sickness could kill healthy adults within hours of onset. Medieval people had no understanding of contagion. When someone got sick, the family's response was to huddle closer together for warmth, ensuring everyone caught whatever was spreading. They believed disease came from bad air or divine punishment, so they sealed their homes even tighter. The medical treatments were often worse than the diseases. Bloodletting weakened already fragile patients. Mercury treatments poisoned them. Cupping with heated glass created painful welts that often became infected. But disease was just one part of a larger, more systematic problem. Medieval society had a built-in death timer that started ticking every autumn. It was a system so brutal that it predetermined who would live and who would die, and there was almost nothing you could do to escape it. Medieval society was designed around winter survival, and most people were designed to die.
Lords in stone castles had multiple fireplaces, stores of salted meat, fine woolen clothing, and servants to maintain their fires. Their winter mortality rate was around 5 to 10%. Merchants and craftsmen in towns fared better than rural peasants, but worse than nobles. They might have glass windows, rare luxury, better food storage, and access to imported goods. Their winter mortality, 15 to 20%. But peasants, 90% of the population, were essentially expendable. They lived in one-room hovels with dirt floors, no windows, and roofs that leaked. Their winter mortality rate reached 30 to 40% in bad years. The system was so brutal that lords actually calculated peasant winter deaths into their economic planning. They knew they'd lose a third of their workforce and planned accordingly. This wasn't accidental, it was social engineering. But even the wealthy weren't safe from winter's deadliest weapon. There was one threat that could kill a king as easily as a peasant, and it struck without warning in the depths of winter. Sudden weather events, what we'd call winter storms, were medieval society's great equalizer. A blizzard could trap a king's hunting party just as easily as a peasant farmer. In 1120, King Henry I's court nearly perished when caught in an unexpected snowstorm while traveling. Their royal winter clothing proved useless against nature's fury. Several courtiers died of exposure despite having the best equipment available. These storms revealed the fundamental truth. All medieval winter survival technology was barely adequate even under good conditions. A sudden temperature drop, an unexpected blizzard, or a fire going out at the wrong moment could kill anyone. Royal chronicles are filled with accounts of nobles found frozen in their carriages, their fine furs and expensive braziers providing no protection against the killing cold. But there's something even more chilling about how these storms exposed medieval society's brutal survival calculations. When noble hunting parties got trapped in blizzards, they survived by making a choice so horrific that it was kept secret for centuries. What they did reveals the true desperation of medieval winter survival. Recently discovered chronicles reveal that trapped noble hunting parties practiced sacrifice protocols. They would abandon servants and guards to die so that the core nobles could survive with limited supplies. This wasn't random, they had predetermined hierarchies of who would be left behind. Servants carried extra clothing specifically so nobles could strip it from their bodies when they were abandoned to freeze. Some parties even practiced deliberate hypothermia, forcing lower-ranking members to strip naked and lie next to dying nobles to transfer body heat, knowing the servants would die in the process. These practices were kept secret because they revealed that even the wealthy were just as desperate and brutal as starving peasants. Winter stripped away all pretense of civilization and reduced everyone to the same savage calculations. But the nobles' survival secrets pale in comparison to what ordinary families did when winter threatened their children. Medieval parents faced the most heartbreaking decision imaginable every winter. What they chose reveals the true horror of trying to keep a family alive when survival itself was a luxury. Medieval families practiced selective survival. They had to choose which children to keep warm and fed and which to let die. This wasn't cruelty, it was mathematics. A family might have enough resources to keep 2 children alive through winter, but not 4. Parents had to calculate which children were most likely to survive, most useful for spring farming, or most capable of caring for elderly parents. Infant mortality in winter reached 60 to 70%. Many families didn't even name children born in autumn, knowing they probably wouldn't survive to spring. They practiced emotional distancing, not bonding with winter babies until they proved they could survive. The most heartbreaking records describe parents wrapping their dying children in their own clothes, knowing they were also condemning themselves to freeze, but unable to watch their children die cold.
These impossible choices created psychological trauma that lasted generations, but they weren't the worst part of medieval winter survival. There was a practice so disturbing that medieval chroniclers wrote about it in code. It involved the elderly, and when you understand what families did to survive winter, you'll see why some people chose to walk out into the snow and never return. Medieval chronicles describe a practice called winter walking. Elderly family members who would simply leave their homes during blizzards and never return. This wasn't suicide in the modern sense, it was sacrifice. Elderly people understood the brutal math. They consumed calories but couldn't work. They needed more warmth but couldn't contribute to fire gathering. They were more susceptible to disease but took up space in crowded, warm areas. Some communities developed coded rituals around this. An elderly person would announce they were going to check the animals during a blizzard. Everyone knew what this meant. No one stopped them. Their sacrifice might save the rest of the family. Swedish and Norwegian folklore preserve stories of unalive cliffs where elderly people would throw themselves off during famines and harsh winters. Archaeological evidence suggests these stories were based on real practices. This wasn't just Nordic brutality, it happened across Europe. Winter forced impossible choices that violated every human instinct, but some medieval people refused to accept these unalive sentences. They developed survival techniques so extreme and innovative that they bordered on genius. What they created might shock you. Desperate medieval people became incredible innovators. They developed human heating systems where families would take turns being the warm body. One person would exercise continuously in shifts to generate heat for the others. They created fat banking, deliberately gaining weight in autumn by eating anything available, then slowly starving through winter while their body fat provided insulation and calories. Some people gained 40 to 50 pounds specifically for winter survival. Dramatic tribes developed hibernation techniques. They would slow their metabolism by staying almost motionless for days, similar to how animals hibernate. They'd wake periodically to tend the fire and eat minimal food, then return to their dormant state. Russian communities created underground winter cities, extensive tunnel systems connecting homes so people could move between houses without going outside. Some of these tunnel networks housed entire villages for months. But the most ingenious survival technique was also the most dangerous. They discovered a way to create emergency warmth that could save your life in minutes. But it was so risky that using it wrong would kill you faster than freezing. Medieval people called it devil's heat. Medieval people discovered that strong spirits could create emergency warmth from the inside out, but they also learned it could kill you. They developed winter ales with alcohol content reaching 12 to 15%, much stronger than normal beer. In emergencies, they'd consume what they called fire water, primitive distilled spirits that could warm you almost instantly. But alcohol also impairs judgment, makes you lose heat faster once it wears off, and can cause fatal alcohol poisoning when consumed in survival quantities. Medieval chronicles describe people who drank themselves warm only to stumble outside and freeze to unalive because they couldn't feel the cold. Some communities developed elaborate protocols around winter drinking. Who could drink when, how much, and under what supervision? They understood it was medicine that could easily become poison. The most dangerous part was that alcohol gave false confidence. Medieval people who felt brave enough to venture outside in winter often discovered a landscape so alien and hostile that it challenged their understanding of reality itself. What they found out there defied belief. Medieval winter transformed the familiar world into an alien planet. Rivers became highways. Forests became crystal cathedrals of ice.
But this beauty was deadly. Travelers reported snow so deep it buried entire villages. Only church spires and chimney smoke revealed where people lived. Some communities were cut off for 4 to 5 months, completely isolated from the outside world. The cold was so intense that spit would freeze before hitting the ground. Exposed skin would stick to metal tools and tear off when pulled away. Wine froze solid in cellars, expanding and shattering the barrels. Wildlife behavior became erratic. Wolves, normally afraid of humans, would attack villages in desperate hunger. Bears, unable to properly hibernate due to food scarcity, became winter predators. Even domestic animals turned dangerous when starving. But the most terrifying aspect of the winter landscape was how it played tricks on the mind. Medieval people reported seeing things in the winter wilderness that shouldn't exist. Their accounts describe encounters so bizarre that modern psychologists have a specific name for what was happening to them. Hypothermia, malnutrition, and sensory deprivation created what medieval people called winter madness, but we now recognize as complex psychological breakdown. Starving, cold brains hallucinate. Medieval winter survivors reported seeing demons in the snow, hearing voices in the wind, and encountering winter spirits that led them astray. These weren't superstitions, they were neurological symptoms of severe malnutrition and hypothermia. Vitamin deficiencies caused paranoia and violent mood swings. Families turned on each other, convinced that someone was hoarding food or plotting betrayal. Medieval chronicles describe murder rates that spiked dramatically during winter months. The isolation made it worse. Snowed-in families would develop shared delusions, group paranoia, and what we'd now call mass hysteria. Entire households would become convinced they were under attack by supernatural forces. Some people developed winter catatonia. They'd simply stop moving, stop eating, stop responding to any stimulus. Their families would find them alive, but completely unresponsive, staring into space. But there was one group of medieval people who not only survived these winters, but actually thrived in them. Their secret techniques were so effective that they became the most feared and respected people in medieval society. The Norse Vikings didn't just survive medieval winters, they used winter as a weapon. While the rest of Europe huddled in terror, Vikings launched winter raids when their enemies were weakest. Their survival techniques were revolutionary. They created heat clothing, layered wool systems that trapped air and created insulation. They developed fat diets, consuming massive amounts of whale and seal blubber to build internal insulation. Vikings discovered that certain fermented foods provided crucial nutrients that prevented scurvy and winter madness. Their fermented fish and vegetables kept them healthy when the rest of Europe was dying from deficiency diseases. Most ingeniously, they created portable heat, small metal containers filled with burning charcoal that they carried inside their clothing. These heat stones could keep them warm for hours during raids or travel. Their longhouses were engineering marvels, partially underground with sophisticated ventilation systems that provided fresh air without losing heat. They could house 50-plus people safely through entire winters. But even the Vikings feared one aspect of medieval winter. There was a phenomenon so terrifying that even battle-hardened Vikings refused to venture out when it occurred. Modern science has finally explained what medieval people called the white unalive. Medieval people called it the white unalive. Blizzards so intense they created complete whiteouts where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. But the real killer wasn't the visibility, it was the wind chill. Medieval people had no understanding of this concept, but they experienced its deadly effects. A mild winter day of 20 degrees Fahrenheit could become lethal with wind speeds that dropped the effective temperature to -40 degrees Fahrenheit.
People caught in these conditions would experience rapid hypothermia. First, they'd lose fine motor control, unable to work latches or tie knots. Then, confusion would set in, making them lose their way even in familiar places. Finally, paradoxical undressing. Hypothermia victims would feel suddenly warm and remove their clothes, accelerating their unalive. Medieval chronicles describe finding frozen bodies completely naked in the snow, leading to superstitions about demons or madness. We now know these people died from their own confused attempts to cool down while freezing to unalive. The white unalive could strike without warning, turning a routine trip to the barn into a fatal expedition. But medieval people developed warning systems for these killer storms that were so accurate they seem almost supernatural. How they predicted deadly weather without any modern technology will amaze you. Medieval people became incredibly sophisticated weather readers out of pure necessity. Their lives depended on predicting when the white unalive was approaching. They observed animal behavior with scientific precision. Cattle gathering in tight groups meant a storm within 24 hours. Birds flying low indicated pressure changes that preceded blizzards. Even insects provided clues. Certain beetles would burrow deeper before temperature drops. They tracked wind patterns, cloud formations, and even the smell of the air. Experienced winter survivors could predict deadly storms 2 to 3 days in advance with remarkable accuracy. Some families designated weather watchers, usually elderly people with decades of experience reading nature signs. These individuals were so valuable that communities would feed them even during famines because their predictions meant the difference between life and unalive. But their most reliable predictor was something you'd never expect. Medieval people discovered that their own bodies were better weather predictors than any instrument. They learned to read unalive signs in themselves and others that warned of incoming killer storms. Medieval people noticed that their bodies reacted to pressure changes before storms hit. Joint pain intensified, old wounds ached, and people became irritable and restless 24 to 48 hours before major weather events. They cataloged these body signs with scientific precision. Sudden headaches in multiple family members meant pressure dropping. Unusual fatigue indicated incoming storms. Even their animals showed predictable behavioral changes. Women noted that childbirth complications increased before severe weather, leading to the practice of moving pregnant women to storm shelters when body signs indicated incoming blizzards. Their most reliable human predictor was what they called bone weather. People with old fractures could predict deadly cold fronts with startling accuracy. These bone readers became valuable community assets. But reading the signs was only half the battle. When medieval people detected incoming deadly weather, they had minutes to implement emergency protocols that determined who would live and who would die. Their emergency procedures were so precise they seem almost military. Medieval communities developed sophisticated emergency protocols that kicked in when storm signs appeared. These weren't casual preparations, they were life or unalive military operations. Every family member had specific roles. Children gathered every piece of burnable material. Women secured food and water inside. Men reinforced doors and windows against wind pressure that could literally blow houses apart. They practiced resource consolidation. Multiple families would abandon their homes and crowd into the best insulated house in the area. Sometimes 20-30 people would shelter together in a space meant for 5. Communities had storm wardens who made brutal decisions about resource allocation. Who got the warmest spots? Who got extra food? Who would take the dangerous duty of maintaining the fire through the night? These protocols were rehearsed like military drills because hesitation meant unalive.
But even perfect preparation couldn't save you from winter's most insidious killer. This threat was so subtle that people would die without ever realizing they were in danger, and it's something that would kill most modern people within hours. Dehydration. In brutal cold, medieval people didn't feel thirsty, didn't sweat visibly, and had no idea they were dying from lack of water. Cold air is extremely dry and pulls moisture from your lungs with every breath. Medieval people, breathing the dry air of their poorly ventilated homes, were constantly losing water without realizing it. But their water sources were often frozen or contaminated. Melting snow and ice required precious fuel. Well water could freeze solid. Rivers became ice-covered, unalive traps where one wrong step meant drowning under the ice. Medieval people developed winter thirst madness, severe dehydration that caused hallucinations, kidney failure, and unalive. They didn't understand the connection between their symptoms and water intake. Some tried drinking alcohol instead of water, which accelerated dehydration and created a deadly cycle. Others ate snow directly, which lowered their core temperature while providing minimal hydration. The cruel irony? Water was everywhere around them, but all of it was trying to kill them. Medieval people who solved the water problem still faced a challenge that would break most modern minds. They had to do something every single day that required facing their own mortality in the most direct way possible. Every single day, medieval families performed unalive mathematics, calculating exactly how many calories, how much fuel, and how much warmth they could afford while still having enough to survive until spring. They counted individual sticks of firewood like gold coins. They measured food portions to the gram. They calculated how many hours each person could spend in the warm area of the house. Families kept unalive ledgers, actual written records of their remaining supplies versus the days until spring. When the numbers didn't add up, they knew someone would die, and they had to choose who. These daily calculations meant medieval people lived with the constant awareness that they might not survive the next week. They went to sleep every night knowing it might be their last, not from disease or accident, but from simple resource mathematics. Children grew up performing these calculations as naturally as breathing. They learned to count their own remaining days alongside their letters and prayers. This constant proximity to unalive created a medieval mentality that's almost impossible for us to understand, but it also led to survival innovations that were so brilliant they seem like magic. Desperate medieval people created solutions that seemed like magic but were actually brilliant engineering. They developed warming stones, rocks heated in fires, then wrapped in cloth and rotated between family members through the night. They created heat walls, double-wall construction filled with animal dung, which decomposed slowly all winter, generating heat through biological processes. These walls could keep a room 20 degrees warmer than outside temperature. Medieval blacksmiths invented fire bottles, metal containers that burned charcoal inside while remaining safe to hold. These portable heaters could keep people warm while traveling or working outside. They developed body heat banking techniques for capturing and storing their own body heat in clothing and bedding. Goose down was reserved for the wealthy, but peasants created insulation from cattail fluff, sheep wool, and even human hair. But their most ingenious innovation was also psychological. Medieval people discovered that survival wasn't just physical. It was mental warfare against despair. They developed psychological techniques that could literally keep people alive when hope was gone. Medieval communities developed hope protocols, systematic psychological techniques to prevent winter despair from becoming fatal. They created elaborate storytelling traditions where families would spend hours each night telling stories, not for entertainment, but for survival. These stories served multiple purposes. They distracted from hunger and cold, created shared mental experiences that built community bonds, and most importantly, always ended with spring's return. Villages practiced rotation hope, Different families would take turns being optimistic and energetic, supporting those who were sinking into despair. They understood that psychological collapse could kill as surely as starvation. They developed future planning rituals, detailed discussions about spring planting, summer festivals, and autumn harvests. Talking about the future as if it was certain helped people endure present suffering. Medieval monks perfected meditation warming, breathing and mental techniques that could actually raise body temperature through concentration. Some could meditate themselves warm enough to survive nights without fire. But their most powerful psychological tool was also their most dangerous. Medieval people discovered that shared suffering created bonds so intense they bordered on religious experience. But this same psychological mechanism could turn families into something unrecognizable. Extreme winter survival created psychological bonds unlike anything in normal life. Families who survived together developed telepathic-like communication, sharing resources and warmth with perfect coordination. But these bonds came with a dark side. Families became intensely tribal, viewing anyone outside their survival group as a threat. Winter families would attack neighbors for resources, even neighbors they'd been friendly with for years. Survival groups developed their own languages, customs, and moral codes that justified previously unthinkable acts. Stealing food from another family wasn't theft, it was protecting your survival group. Abandoning the weak wasn't cruelty, it was mathematical necessity. These winter bonds were so intense that some families couldn't readjust to normal life when spring returned. They'd remain suspicious, hoarding, and aggressive long after the danger passed. Medieval chroniclers described winter madness that persisted into summer. People who'd survived brutal winters but could never psychologically escape them. This psychological scarring created a medieval phenomenon that historians are only now beginning to understand. Entire regions developed cultures built around winter trauma, and what they became would shock you. Different regions developed distinct winter cultures based on their survival traumas. Northern German communities became obsessively organized, developing precise protocols for every aspect of winter survival. Their descendants still exhibit these traits today. Russian communities developed communal survival cultures, where individual identity became secondary to group survival. They practiced collective decision-making that could override personal preferences for the group's benefit. Scandinavian cultures developed stoic winter traditions, emotional suppression techniques that helped people endure suffering without breaking down. They created cultural taboos around expressing pain, fear, or despair during winter months. Alpine communities became intensely religious, developing elaborate winter rituals and prayers that served as psychological anchors during the darkest months. Their winter festivals weren't celebrations, they were survival ceremonies. But some regions developed something much darker. In the most brutal winter regions, medieval people developed practices so extreme they had to be kept secret from the church and neighboring communities. What they did crosses every line of civilized behavior. In the harshest winter regions, survival cannibalism wasn't just emergency desperation, it became systematized. Communities developed protocols for who would be consumed first when food ran out. They created meat preservation techniques for human flesh that they'd never use for animals. They developed cooking methods that disguised the source of the protein. They created elaborate rituals around these practices to maintain psychological distance from what they were doing. Some communities practiced voluntary sacrifice. Elderly or sick members would agree to become food for the group. These weren't random acts of desperation, but organized community decisions with formal protocols. Medieval church records described entire villages that had to be purified after winter survival because of what they'd done to stay alive. The church developed special confession procedures for winter sins that were too horrific for normal absolution. These practices were so secretive that many details were never recorded, passed down only through coded oral traditions. But even communities that avoided these extremes faced a problem that would destroy most modern families.
Medieval winter created permanent psychological damage that lasted for generations.
Medieval winter survival created what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD that was passed down through families for generations. Children who survived brutal winters became adults who couldn't trust abundance, couldn't relax during warm seasons, and lived in constant preparation for the next winter catastrophe. These trauma responses became cultural DNA. Medieval families developed winter personalities, becoming suspicious, hoarding, and emotionally distant as autumn approached. Even during summer plenty, they remained psychologically trapped in winter scarcity. Parents who'd survived childhood winters through family sacrifice became adults who viewed their own children as potential resources rather than individuals to protect. The survival mathematics never left their minds. Some families developed winter madness cycles, psychological breakdowns that occurred every winter regardless of actual conditions, triggered by traumatic memories of previous survival experiences. Medieval chroniclers described entire bloodlines that seemed cursed by winter. Families where each generation suffered psychological collapse during cold months, creating cycles of winter trauma that lasted centuries. This psychological scarring explains one of medieval history's greatest mysteries: why certain communities suddenly abandoned fertile land and prosperous towns for no apparent reason. Archaeological evidence shows thousands of medieval villages that were simply abandoned between 1300 and 1500, often during or right after particularly brutal winters. These weren't gradual migrations, they were sudden mass evacuations. Recent research reveals these abandonments followed a pattern. Communities that had survived multiple horrific winters through extreme measures would suddenly flee, leaving behind houses, tools, and even stored food. The psychological trauma of winter survival became so severe that entire communities preferred to face the unknown dangers of migration rather than endure another winter in places associated with such suffering. Some villages show evidence of ritual abandonment, deliberate destruction of homes and tools, as if the community was trying to erase all memory of what they endured there. These abandoned sites often remained uninhabited for centuries, even when the land was good and the climate improved. The psychological scars ran too deep for people to return. But some medieval communities took the opposite approach. Instead of fleeing their winter trauma, they embraced it and created something so dark it barely qualifies as human civilization. In the most isolated regions, some medieval communities developed what historians now call winter cults, societies organized entirely around extreme winter survival at any cost. These groups practiced ritualized cannibalism, infant sacrifice during food shortages, and elaborate ceremonies around choosing who would die to save others. They developed their own moral systems where traditional ethics were suspended during winter months. Winter cult communities often survived when neighboring normal villages perished, but at the cost of becoming something barely recognizable as human society. They created art, songs, and stories celebrating unalive and sacrifice as noble winter traditions. Some groups developed winter gods, deities specifically worshipped for their power over life and unalive during cold months. These weren't loving gods, but cruel entities that demanded blood sacrifice in exchange for survival. Archaeological evidence suggests these communities practiced selective breeding, favoring traits like cold resistance and psychological resilience over traditional values like empathy or cooperation. The strangest part is that some of these winter cult practices actually worked better than normal medieval survival methods. Their innovations were so effective that we're only now beginning to understand the science behind them. Winter cult communities developed survival techniques that modern science confirms were remarkably effective despite their horrific moral costs. Their practice of consuming human fat during extreme cold provided crucial calories and insulation that animal fat couldn't match. Human adipose tissue has unique properties that help the body maintain temperature in ways that medieval people couldn't understand but instinctively utilized. They developed blood warming, consuming fresh blood from sacrifice victims, which provided immediate warmth, essential nutrients, and prevented scurvy. While morally reprehensible, it was scientifically sound. Their selective breeding programs actually produced people with genetic advantages for cold survival, higher muscle mass, more efficient metabolism, and psychological traits that help them endure extreme suffering without breaking down. Most disturbing of all, their ritualized killing methods were designed to minimize trauma to the survivors while maximizing the survival benefit. They understood psychology in ways that wouldn't be formally studied for centuries. But these extreme communities eventually discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about winter survival. What they found challenges our understanding of human endurance itself. Around 1400, some winter cult communities discovered induced hibernation, techniques for dramatically slowing human metabolism during the coldest months. They learned to enter states where their heart rate dropped to 30 to 40 beats per minute, their breathing became barely detectable, and their caloric needs decreased by up to 70%. They could sleep through the worst winter months, awakening periodically to tend fires and consume minimal food. This wasn't just meditation or wishful thinking. Modern research on extreme cold survival confirms that humans can achieve hibernation-like states under specific conditions. These medieval communities somehow figured out techniques that we're only now rediscovering. They developed specific breathing patterns, body positions, and mental exercises that triggered these states. The most skilled practitioners could hibernate for weeks at a time, aging their bodies almost imperceptibly while winter raged around them. But there was a terrible cost to these techniques. People who mastered medieval hibernation techniques often couldn't return to normal consciousness. They became something between human and animal, and what happened to them reveals the ultimate price of winter survival. Medieval hibernators often emerged from winter changed in ways that terrified their communities. Extended periods in near unalive states affected their minds, personalities, and even their physical appearance. Some couldn't fully wake up, remaining in dreamlike states where they responded to stimuli but showed no recognition of family members. Others developed what chroniclers called winter eyes, thousand-yard stares that never focused on anything. The most skilled hibernators sometimes couldn't stop the process. They'd continue entering hibernation states even during summer, becoming increasingly disconnected from normal human life. Their families would find them unconscious for days, barely breathing, unreachable. Some became winter prophets, individuals who claimed to receive visions during hibernation that predicted future winters, famines, and unalives. Communities both revered and feared these people, believing they'd traded their humanity for supernatural knowledge. Medical analysis of medieval remains suggests these hibernators experienced permanent brain changes, similar to what we see in extreme hypothermia survivors today. But the most disturbing discovery about medieval winter survival is how it changed human evolution itself. What happened to our ancestors during these brutal winters is still affecting us today. 7 centuries of brutal winter survival created evolutionary pressures that literally changed human genetics. Populations that survived the Little Ice Age developed genetic advantages that their descendants still carry. Northern Europeans gained mutations that increase brown fat production, specialized fat that burns calories to generate heat. Scandinavians developed genetic variations that allow their bodies to function on fewer calories during cold periods.
Russian populations show genetic markers for increased alcohol tolerance because alcohol was crucial for winter survival. Their livers became more efficient at processing the spirits that kept their ancestors alive. Some populations developed psychological genetic traits, increased stoicism, reduced empathy responses, and enhanced planning abilities. These winter genes helped ancestors survive, but sometimes make their descendants seem emotionally distant. Most remarkably, some bloodlines show genetic markers for increased cold tolerance that shouldn't exist in human populations. Medieval winter survival may have triggered evolutionary changes that happened in centuries rather than millennia. This genetic legacy explains why modern people from different regions react so differently to cold. But it also reveals something terrifying about what would happen if we faced medieval winter conditions today. Modern humans have lost almost every survival skill that kept medieval people alive during winter. We've gained comfort but sacrificed resilience in ways that would make us helpless in medieval conditions. We can't start fires from scratch, can't preserve food without refrigeration, can't read weather signs, and can't tolerate discomfort that medieval children accepted as normal. Our bodies are softer, our minds less prepared for suffering, our communities less cooperative under stress. But worse, we've lost the psychological hardness that medieval people developed. Modern people panic when the power goes out for a few hours. Medieval people lived without electricity for months and maintained their sanity. Our food supply chains are so complex that a single supply disruption could create famine conditions in days. Medieval people expected supply failures and planned accordingly. Most terrifying of all, we've lost the community bonds that made collective survival possible. Recent climate events have shown exactly how vulnerable we've become. When modern communities face even mild winter emergencies, the results are often more catastrophic than what medieval people endured regularly. The 2021 Texas winter storm killed over 200 people in conditions that medieval Texans would have considered mild. Modern people died in their homes from hypothermia because they'd never learned basic cold survival. Hurricane Sandy and other winter power outages revealed how quickly modern society collapses without central heating. People died from carbon monoxide poisoning using barbecue grills indoors, the same mistake that killed medieval families, but with modern equipment. During winter emergencies, modern communities often see increased crime, hoarding, and social breakdown within days. Medieval communities, despite facing much worse conditions, maintained cooperation for months. The difference is psychological preparation. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that winter could kill them. Modern people are shocked when winter becomes dangerous. But there's something even more concerning about our modern vulnerability. Modern climate change isn't just making winters warmer, it's making them more unpredictable and potentially more dangerous. What's coming could combine medieval-level winter threats with modern-level unpreparedness. Climate scientists warn that global warming doesn't mean easier winters. It means more chaotic, unpredictable winters with extreme events that can overwhelm modern infrastructure. Polar vortex events can drop temperatures 50 to 60 degrees in hours, faster than medieval blizzards. Our centralized heating systems become single points of failure that can leave millions without heat simultaneously. Our modern just-in-time food delivery means we have 3 to 5 days of food in most communities. Medieval people kept months of supplies as standard practice. A modern supply chain disruption during a winter emergency could create famine conditions faster than anything medieval people experienced. Our electrical grid is vulnerable to ice storms, solar events, and extreme weather in ways that medieval heating systems weren't. When modern heating fails, we have no backup systems and no survival knowledge. We've created a civilization that's incredibly efficient in normal conditions, but catastrophically vulnerable to the kind of winter events that our ancestors survived regularly. But buried in medieval winter survival knowledge are techniques that could save modern lives if we knew how to use them. Some of these methods are so counterintuitive they seem impossible. Medieval people discovered that certain counterintuitive actions could mean the difference between life and unalive in winter emergencies. They learned that removing outer clothing layers in certain wind conditions could actually keep you warmer by preventing convective heat loss. They understood wind patterns and microclimate creation in ways that modern people have forgotten. They developed emergency heat, techniques using minimal materials, creating warming systems from stones, candles, and body heat that could keep people alive in situations where modern people would die. Medieval people mastered starvation protocols, ways to extend survival time during food shortages by carefully managing metabolism, activity levels, and psychological state. They could survive on 800 to 1,000 calories per day for months while maintaining cognitive function. They understood community thermodynamics, how to organize groups of people to maximize collective warmth and minimize heat loss. Their techniques for sharing body heat were precise sciences that modern emergency medicine is only beginning to rediscover. Modern survival experts who have studied medieval techniques describe them as impossible until you see them work. But there's one medieval winter skill that's so advanced we still can't fully replicate it. The most elite medieval winter survivors developed what chroniclers called winter sight, the ability to read dozens of environmental cues simultaneously to predict survival outcomes with uncanny accuracy. These masters could look at a room and instantly assess how long the fire would last, whether the occupants had enough food, who was likely to get sick first, and what the optimal survival strategy would be. They became human computers calculating life and unalive in real time. They could determine someone's remaining survival time by observing breathing patterns, skin color, movement efficiency, and psychological state. Their predictions were so accurate that communities would change their entire winter strategies based on a master's assessment. These individuals developed almost superhuman cold tolerance, enhanced night vision, and the ability to function on minimal food and sleep. They became living examples of what human beings could become under extreme evolutionary pressure. But their abilities came with a terrible isolation. Medieval winter masters often couldn't form normal human relationships because their survival-focused minds saw everyone as resources, threats, or calculation variables. They became something between human and machine.
Medieval winter masters paid for their skills with their humanity. They couldn't stop calculating survival probabilities, even during safe summer months. They viewed every human interaction through the lens of resource management and survival utility. These individuals often lived alone because they couldn't maintain family bonds. Their minds automatically assessed family members' survival value, caloric consumption, and likelihood of becoming a liability during winter emergencies. They became emotionally numb to suffering because compassion was a survival disadvantage. Watching someone die from cold or hunger became as routine as observing weather changes. They lost the ability to form attachments that might compromise survival decisions. Medieval communities both relied on and feared these individuals. They were essential for group survival, but psychologically incompatible with normal human society. Some medieval masters developed summer madness, psychological breakdowns during warm months when their hypervigilant survival instincts had nothing to focus on. They couldn't adapt to safety and abundance. But these damaged individuals discovered something extraordinary about human potential that we've completely forgotten. Their techniques reveal capabilities that could revolutionize how we understand human survival. Modern scientists studying medieval survival accounts are discovering that humans have far greater cold survival capabilities than we've assumed. Our ancestors routinely achieved physiological states that we consider impossible. Medieval masters could consciously control their circulation, directing blood flow to warm specific body parts while allowing others to cool safely. They developed breathing techniques that could raise core body temperature by several degrees within minutes. They learned to shut down non-essential body systems during cold emergencies, creating human hibernation states that could extend survival time exponentially. These weren't lucky accidents, they were trained skills passed down through survival lineages. Some could survive core body temperatures that modern medicine considers fatal. They developed techniques for rewarming hypothermia survivors that were more effective than modern hospital procedures. Most remarkably, they could teach these abilities to others, creating communities of people with enhanced cold survival capabilities that seemed almost superhuman. These discoveries are revolutionizing modern survival medicine, but they're also revealing something disturbing about what we've lost as a species. In gaining comfort and technology, we've lost fundamental human capabilities that took our ancestors centuries to develop. We've become a domesticated species that can't survive without our technological life support systems. Medieval people's pain tolerance was so high that they could perform surgery on themselves without anesthesia. Modern people often can't tolerate minor discomfort without medical intervention. They could function normally on calorie intakes that would put modern people in the hospital. They could work productively at activity levels that we'd consider starvation conditions. Most importantly, they could make life and unalive decisions without psychological breakdown. Modern people often require therapy after much less traumatic experiences. We've traded resilience for comfort, and the exchange rate is becoming problematic as our world becomes less predictable. But there's hope buried in these dark medieval stories. Hidden among the horror are survival principles that could prepare us for future challenges without the psychological costs our ancestors paid. We can learn medieval winter survival wisdom without experiencing medieval winter trauma. Modern psychology understands how to build resilience without breaking people's minds. Physical preparation doesn't require suffering. We can develop cold tolerance, improve our metabolism, and build survival skills through gradual training rather than life or unalive desperation. Community preparation can restore the cooperation that made medieval survival possible while maintaining modern ethics and compassion. We can practice resource sharing and emergency protocols without the brutal triage decisions our ancestors faced. Most importantly, we can develop psychological resilience through controlled challenges rather than traumatic survival experiences. Modern people can build the mental toughness that medieval people developed through suffering. The key is learning from their innovations while avoiding their trauma. Some modern communities are already implementing these lessons, creating hybrid societies that combine medieval winter survival wisdom with modern knowledge. They're preparing for uncertain futures by reviving forgotten knowledge. These groups practice seasonal resource management, community cooperation protocols, and sustainable heating methods that echo medieval techniques but avoid the brutal social costs. They've developed modern versions of medieval innovations, improved heating stones using modern materials, community food storage systems that prevent hoarding, and psychological support networks that maintain hope during difficult periods. Some communities practice voluntary simplicity during winter months, deliberately reducing their dependence on modern conveniences to build resilience and appreciation for basic survival needs. These modern winter communities are proving that we can regain human survival capabilities without losing our humanity. But even these prepared modern communities would struggle with the ultimate medieval winter challenge: There's one test of winter survival that broke even the strongest medieval communities. The winter of 1709 was called Le Grand Hiver, the Great Winter. It was so cold that wine froze inside heated castles, so brutal that Venice's canals froze solid, so deadly that France lost 20% of its population. This winter broke communities that had survived centuries of brutal conditions. It killed survival masters who'd endured dozens of previous winters. It revealed the absolute limits of human winter survival capabilities. Even the most prepared communities faced impossible choices during the Grand Winter. Food stores that should have lasted until spring were exhausted by Christmas. Firewood supplies calculated for normal harsh winters proved completely inadequate. This ultimate winter showed that no amount of preparation could guarantee survival against nature's worst extremes. It humbled the most arrogant survival masters and destroyed the most resilient communities. But it also revealed something inspiring about human nature. In the face of this ultimate winter catastrophe, medieval people demonstrated something beautiful that our modern world desperately needs to rediscover. During Le Grand Hiver, the worst winter in European history, something remarkable happened. Instead of descending into complete savagery, many communities reached new heights of cooperation and sacrifice. Wealthy families opened their stores to neighbors, knowing they were likely condemning themselves to unalive. Communities shared their last pieces of firewood with strangers. Parents gave their final food to other people's children when their own were beyond saving. These acts of generosity during desperate conditions created bonds that lasted generations. Communities that survived Le Grand Hiver together developed loyalties and trust that transcended normal social boundaries. Medieval chroniclers described these survival communities as achieving something approaching sainthood. People who discovered that sharing in the face of unalive created meaning that transcended individual survival. They learned that dying together with dignity was preferable to living alone through betrayal. This medieval wisdom about community survival contains lessons that could transform how we face modern challenges. But first, you need to understand the specific techniques that made such cooperation possible. Medieval communities developed sophisticated cooperation protocols that prevented winter survival from descending into chaos. These weren't just moral guidelines, they were practical systems for managing resources and people under extreme stress. They created rotation systems where different families took turns using the best heated spaces, ensuring everyone got periods of warmth while maintaining fairness. They developed skill sharing, where individuals taught their specialties to others, creating redundant capabilities within the community. They practiced transparent resource management. All supplies were openly counted and allocated according to predetermined formulas that everyone understood. This prevented hoarding and reduced conflicts over distribution. Most importantly, they created sacrifice protocols that honored people who gave up resources for others, creating social incentives for cooperation rather than selfishness. These systems worked because they were designed by people who understood that individual survival was impossible. Everyone survived together, or everyone died together. But the most powerful medieval survival tool wasn't physical or social. It was something that modern people have almost completely abandoned. Medieval people possessed something that gave them tremendous psychological advantage during winter survival: complete acceptance of unalive as a likely outcome. This wasn't pessimism or depression. It was realistic assessment that eliminated the panic and denial that kill modern people in emergencies. They could make clear-headed survival decisions because they weren't wasting mental energy denying their situation. They practiced unalive preparation rituals, regular discussions about who would inherit what, how bodies would be handled, and what final messages should be delivered. This preparation freed them to focus entirely on survival actions rather than emotional processing. Medieval people could watch family members die without losing their ability to make rational survival decisions for the remaining family. They grieved, but they didn't let grief prevent them from taking actions that might save others. This acceptance, paradoxically, helped them survive because they weren't fighting reality. This psychological strength was built on a foundation that modern people find almost impossible to understand. Medieval people had a relationship with suffering that we've completely lost. Medieval people experienced regular suffering that built psychological and physical tolerance for winter hardships. Hunger, cold, pain, and discomfort were normal parts of life rather than emergencies requiring immediate relief. They developed suffering skills, techniques for enduring pain without losing cognitive function. They could work effectively while hungry, cold, and exhausted because these conditions were familiar rather than panic-inducing. Medieval children were deliberately exposed to controlled hardships to build survival resilience. They learned to ignore discomfort, push through fatigue, and maintain focus during physical stress. This suffering training created adults who could function normally under conditions that would incapacitate modern people. They weren't tougher genetically, they were tougher experientially. But they also understood something about suffering that we've forgotten. Medieval people discovered that suffering, when shared correctly, could actually create joy and meaning that transcended the physical experience. What they learned could transform how we face any challenge. Medieval winter communities discovered that shared suffering could create the deepest human bonds and most profound sense of meaning. Families that survived brutal winters together reported feeling more connected to each other than to their own pre-winter identities. They developed rituals around suffering that transformed individual pain into collective strength. Group fasting, shared cold exposure, and communal discomfort became bonding experiences rather than just hardships to endure. Medieval people often described their worst winters as their most meaningful experiences. The proximity to unalive, the necessity of cooperation, and the stripping away of everything non-essential revealed what they truly valued. Some winter survivors reported that normal life felt hollow after experiencing the intensity of survival conditions. They'd voluntarily recreate some hardships because they'd learned that challenge could create meaning that comfort couldn't provide. This wasn't masochism. It was the discovery that humans need some level of challenge to feel fully alive. This medieval insight about challenge and meaning reveals why so many modern people feel empty despite having everything our ancestors dreamed of. But it also shows us how to reclaim that sense of purpose. Medieval winter survival created what psychologists now call post-traumatic growth. People who became stronger, more capable, and more connected through their survival experiences. Modern research confirms that controlled challenges can create similar benefits without traumatic costs. We can deliberately practice skills, build resilience, and create community bonds through chosen difficulties rather than imposed suffering. Some communities practice winter challenges, voluntary simplicity periods where they reduce their dependence on modern conveniences, practice survival skills, and strengthen community cooperation. These experiences help people appreciate normal comfort while building confidence that they could handle emergencies. They create the psychological resilience that medieval people developed through necessity. Most importantly, they restore the sense of competence and community that our ancestors gained through survival challenges. But there's a dark side to romanticizing medieval survival skills. Modern people attempting medieval techniques without proper knowledge have died in ways that would horrify our ancestors. Survivalist communities attempting to recreate medieval winter techniques have experienced shocking failures. People have died from carbon monoxide poisoning trying to use medieval heating methods, starved attempting medieval fasting protocols, and suffered severe hypothermia from misunderstanding medieval clothing techniques. The problem is that medieval survival skills required lifelong training and cultural knowledge that can't be learned from books or videos. Medieval children spent years developing the intuition that kept them alive: when to break rules, when to take risks, when to abandon protocols. Modern people often approach medieval techniques with dangerous romanticism, underestimating the skill level required and overestimating their own capabilities. They attempt advanced techniques without mastering the basics, creating deadly situations. But the most dangerous mistake is misunderstanding medieval community dynamics. Modern survival groups trying to recreate medieval cooperation often create situations more dangerous than the emergencies they're preparing for. What Goes Wrong reveals why medieval survival was as much about psychology as physical technique. Medieval winter survival required specific psychological conditions that modern groups struggle to recreate. Everyone had to accept predetermined hierarchies, resource allocation systems, and sacrifice protocols without question. This worked in medieval times because people grew up with these social structures and understood their roles from childhood. Modern people, raised with individual rights and democratic decision-making, often can't adapt to the authoritarian structures that winter survival requires. Medieval communities could make brutal triage decisions quickly because they'd mentally prepared for these choices their entire lives. Modern groups often debate survival decisions until it's too late to implement them effectively. The most successful medieval winter communities had leaders with absolute authority during emergencies. Modern groups trying to maintain consensus during crises often make fatally slow decisions. But medieval psychology had another crucial component that modern people find almost impossible to develop. Medieval people possessed a mindset that made them willing to die for community survival in ways that modern individualism can't match. This psychological difference was often the deciding factor between communities that lived and communities that died. Medieval people were raised with the understanding that individual survival was less important than community survival. This wasn't just philosophy, it was practical psychology that kept communities alive. They practiced sacrifice training from childhood, games and exercises that prepared them to give up resources, comfort, and even life for the group's benefit. This training created adults who could make selfless decisions under extreme pressure without hesitation. Medieval winter survivors often described feeling proud and fulfilled when making sacrifices that saved others, even when those sacrifices cost them severely. They found meaning in suffering that benefited their community. This mindset created positive feedback loops where individual sacrifice inspired others to sacrifice, creating upward spirals of cooperation that could carry communities through impossible conditions. Modern people, trained to prioritize individual needs and rights, often struggle to make the quick, selfless decisions that winter survival requires. But medieval sacrifice psychology had a shadow side that created some of the most disturbing survival practices in human history. What happened when this mindset went too far reveals the thin line between noble sacrifice and systematic murder. Some medieval communities took sacrifice psychology to horrific extremes, developing systematic killing protocols disguised as noble community service. They created winter tribunals, community councils that decided who should die for the group's benefit. These weren't desperate emergency decisions, but planned eliminations of people deemed burdens. Elderly people, disabled individuals, and anyone who consumed more resources than they produced could be sentenced to unalive through elaborate rituals that framed murder as community sacrifice. Some communities developed sacrifice competitions, where individuals would compete to prove their willingness to die for others, creating peer pressure that pushed people toward self-destruction. These practices reveal how medieval survival psychology could transform normal humans into something monstrous when taken to extremes. The line between survival and savagery was thinner than we'd like to believe. But medieval people also developed safeguards against this darkness that could teach us how to maintain humanity under extreme pressure. The best medieval communities developed humanity protocols, systems designed to maintain moral behavior even under survival pressure. They understood that surviving physically while losing their humanity was a form of failure. They created ethics keepers, individuals whose job was to remind the community of moral boundaries even during desperate times. These people had the authority to veto survival decisions that went too far. Successful communities practiced dignity preservation, ensuring that even sacrifice and unalive were handled with respect and ceremony rather than brutal efficiency. They maintained funeral rites and mourning periods even when resources were scarce. They developed recovery protocols for spring, systematic ways to process the trauma of winter survival and restore normal human relationships when the crisis passed. Most importantly, they understood that some survival techniques were too costly in human terms, even if they were physically effective. This wisdom about balancing survival and humanity becomes crucial when we consider what climate scientists predict for our future. We may need these medieval lessons sooner than we think. Climate scientists warn that our future may include winter events that combine medieval-level danger with modern-level unpreparedness. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more severe. Potential scenarios include infrastructure-destroying ice storms, supply chain-breaking blizzards, and polar vortex events that could overwhelm our heating systems. These events could create medieval-level survival situations within modern society. Our centralized, technology-dependent civilization is more vulnerable to winter emergencies than medieval distributed communities were. A single infrastructure failure could leave millions without heat, power, or food delivery. But we also have advantages our ancestors never dreamed of: global communication, scientific understanding, and technologies that could make winter survival far more survivable if we prepare properly. The question is whether we'll learn medieval survival wisdom before we need it, or whether we'll have to rediscover it through the same traumatic trial and error process our ancestors endured. Some climate scientists believe we're already seeing the early stages of conditions that could require medieval-level survival skills. What's happening in certain regions right now should terrify anyone who understands winter's true power. Recent winter events are displaying patterns that mirror the conditions that created medieval winter catastrophes. Sudden temperature drops, infrastructure failures, and supply chain disruptions are becoming more common and more severe.
The 2021 Texas freeze, European energy crises, and increasing frequency of bomb cyclone storms all echo the unpredictable weather patterns that made medieval winters so deadly. Modern communities are experiencing medieval-style isolation when winter storms knock out power and communication. Families are finding themselves cut off from help, forced to rely on their own resources in ways they're completely unprepared for. Emergency services are overwhelmed during winter events in ways that leave people truly on their own. The same situation medieval people faced, but without the skills or community structures that made survival possible. We're seeing the early stages of a return to conditions where winter survival requires personal resilience rather than technological dependence. The most chilling parallel is how modern communities are starting to make the same brutal survival decisions that medieval people faced. Recent emergencies have revealed how quickly our civilization reverts to medieval survival psychology. During recent winter emergencies, modern communities have rediscovered medieval survival psychology within days of crisis onset. Hoarding, resource guarding, and community breakdown emerge faster than they did in medieval times. Modern people, unpracticed in cooperation during scarcity, often become more selfish more quickly than medieval people who expected hardship. Our comfort-based psychology creates panic that interferes with rational survival decisions. Recent emergencies have seen modern families making triage decisions about heating, food, and medical care that echo medieval practices. But without the cultural frameworks that helped medieval people process these choices, modern families often experience severe trauma. Social media during winter emergencies reveals medieval-style psychological patterns, blame, scapegoating, and conspiracy theories that emerge when people feel helpless against natural forces. The difference is that medieval people had cultural tools for processing survival trauma, while modern people are psychologically naked when comfort disappears. This psychological vulnerability means that modern winter emergencies often create more lasting trauma than medieval people experienced, despite being objectively less severe. We've lost the mental tools that made extreme survival psychologically survivable. Modern people experiencing winter emergencies often develop PTSD from situations that medieval people would have considered routine hardships. We've become psychologically fragile in ways that make us more vulnerable than our ancestors. Medieval people built resilience through gradual exposure to increasing challenges. Modern people often face their first real hardship during actual emergencies, creating overwhelming shock rather than manageable difficulty. They had cultural narratives that framed suffering as temporary, meaningful, and survivable. Modern people often lack these frameworks, experiencing hardship as meaningless punishment rather than manageable challenge. Medieval communities had established support systems for processing survival trauma. Modern communities often isolate trauma survivors, making recovery more difficult and PTSD more likely. Most importantly, medieval people understood that resilience was a skill that required practice, not a natural trait that some people possessed and others lacked. But hidden in medieval survival traditions are techniques for building modern resilience without experiencing medieval trauma. These methods could prepare us for future challenges while maintaining our humanity. We can adapt medieval resilience-building techniques for modern conditions, creating psychological strength without traumatic suffering. Cold water therapy, controlled fasting, and voluntary discomfort can build tolerance for hardship in manageable doses. Modern communities can practice resource sharing, emergency cooperation, and collective decision-making through simulations and exercises, rather than life or unalive situations. We can develop the psychological acceptance that helped medieval people survive by practicing mindfulness, meditation, and cognitive techniques that reduce panic and improve decision-making under stress. Most importantly,
We can build community bonds and support systems before we need them, creating the social infrastructure that made medieval survival possible. The goal isn't to recreate medieval suffering, but to reclaim medieval strength. Some modern communities are already implementing these principles, creating hybrid societies that combine the best of medieval wisdom with modern knowledge. What they're discovering could revolutionize human resilience. Around the world, communities are emerging that blend medieval survival wisdom with modern technology and ethics. They practice seasonal resource management, community cooperation, and resilience building while maintaining modern comfort and values. These communities have weathered recent winter emergencies with remarkable success, maintaining power, heat, and food distribution when surrounding areas failed. Their preparation methods echo medieval practices but avoid the psychological and moral costs. They've developed modern versions of medieval innovations, community heating systems that provide backup when individual systems fail, food storage cooperatives that prevent hoarding, and skill-sharing networks that create redundant capabilities. Most importantly, they practice voluntary challenge, deliberately choosing manageable hardships that build resilience without creating trauma. These communities are proving that we can be simultaneously more comfortable and more resilient than our ancestors. But the ultimate test of these modern medieval communities hasn't come yet. Climate scientists predict that within the next decade, we may face winter conditions that will reveal whether we've truly learned our ancestors' lessons. Climate models predict increasing likelihood of extreme winter events that could test modern resilience in ways we haven't experienced in generations. Solar minimum cycles, volcanic winter scenarios, and infrastructure vulnerabilities could create medieval-level survival challenges. Modern civilization's complexity makes us vulnerable to cascade failures that could knock out heating, power, and food distribution simultaneously. A major solar storm, cyber attack, or extreme weather event could force millions to rely on personal survival skills we no longer possess. The communities that are preparing using medieval-inspired techniques may become the survivors and rebuilders of future civilization. They're developing capabilities that could mean the difference between societal collapse and adaptation. But preparation requires understanding not just the techniques, but the psychology that made medieval survival possible. The most important lesson from medieval winter survival isn't about fire-making or food storage, it's about human transformation. What our ancestors became during their worst winters reveals both our species' darkest potentials and our brightest possibilities. In the winter of 1347, a small village in Scotland faced complete disaster. Their crops had failed, their lord had died in war, and the harshest winter in memory was beginning early. By every calculation, none of them should have survived. But instead of descending into chaos, this community chose to implement every cooperation technique, every survival innovation, and every psychological tool their ancestors had developed. They shared resources with mathematical precision, rotated responsibilities fairly, and maintained hope through deliberate community practices. They didn't just survive, they thrived. When spring came, neighboring communities found them healthier, more united, and more capable than they'd been before the crisis. They'd transformed potential catastrophe into collective growth. The village chronicler wrote, "Winter came to destroy us, but we used winter's tools to build us stronger. We learned that humans are not made weak by challenges. We are made strong by choosing how we meet them." This is the ultimate lesson of medieval winter survival. Not that life is brutal and humans are cruel, but that humans have infinite capacity for resilience, cooperation, and growth when we choose to develop these capabilities together. Today, we've journeyed through 7 centuries of human winter survival, from the catastrophic famines of the 1300s to the innovations that saved lives, from the psychological techniques that maintained sanity
to the community bonds that transcended individual survival. We've seen how medieval winters killed millions, but also forged humans of incredible capability. We've learned that our ancestors developed physical, psychological, and social technologies for surviving impossible conditions, technologies that we've largely forgotten but desperately need to rediscover. We've explored how medieval people transformed suffering into strength, scarcity into cooperation, and mortality into meaning. We've seen both the dark extremes of human survival psychology and the inspiring heights of human resilience and community. Most importantly, we've learned that the difference between surviving and thriving, between maintaining humanity and losing it, between growing through challenge and being broken by it, comes down to conscious choice, community preparation, and psychological training. Medieval winter survival offers us a mirror that reflects both what we've gained and what we've lost as a species. We've gained comfort, technology, and individual freedom. We've lost resilience, community cooperation, and psychological preparation for hardship. But we don't have to choose between medieval toughness and modern compassion. We can integrate the best of both worlds, creating communities that are simultaneously more comfortable and more resilient than anything our ancestors could have imagined. The lessons of medieval winter survival aren't just historical curiosities. They're practical wisdom for anyone who wants to build a life of greater resilience, deeper community connection, and more conscious appreciation for the basic gifts of warmth, food, safety, and human companionship. Whether you ever face an actual winter survival situation or not, developing the capabilities, mindset, and community bonds that kept our ancestors alive will make you stronger, more confident, and more connected in any circumstances you encounter. The medieval winter survivors who maintained their humanity while developing incredible resilience left us a legacy. The knowledge that humans can face almost any challenge successfully when we choose to prepare thoughtfully, cooperate generously, and maintain hope persistently. Their gift to us is the understanding that we are far more capable than we believe, far more resilient than we've been tested to discover, and far more connected to each other than modern individualism suggests. In a world of increasing uncertainty, climate volatility, and social instability, these medieval lessons about human potential, community cooperation, and conscious resilience may be exactly what we need to not just survive future challenges, but to grow stronger through them. The question isn't whether you could survive a medieval winter. It's whether you're willing to learn the lessons that would help you thrive through any winter that life brings you. Our ancestors faced the worst that nature could throw at human beings, and some of them not only survived, but became stronger, wiser, and more connected through the experience. Their legacy proves that humans don't just endure challenges, we can transform them into opportunities for growth that would be impossible under easier circumstances. That transformation, from vulnerable individuals to resilient communities, from comfort-dependent beings to capable survivors, from people who fear challenges to people who use challenges to become their best selves, that transformation is available to us today. We just have to choose it.